Another concept that is obvious in the study of history is the idea of time and what constitutes time. So I'm prompting you to think about scales of time. We can think about anything ranging between a decade, an era, a generation. So these are all concepts that we understand through language. They have their own histories, and we can say that the term decade may seem like an obvious 10-year um, a space of time. But when we study history, for instance, when we look at the 1960s as a decade, that will evoke particular ideas when we say the 1960s. But the cultural images, the movements, the kind of overall characteristics that we associate with the 60s, and of course, this changes depending on who you're asking, um, is not just located within that 10-year boundary. Historians will often refer to this as the long 60s. So when we're thinking about time, those those kind of scales matter. So if you were to study drag in the 1970s, if you were to study drag as it's represented in Esther Newton's book from 1972, that looked at the performing queens versus the street queens, and then how is that different from the approach in this course where we're trying to trace a longer history of drag? Um, what are the what role does time and scales of time play into how we are looking at drag history? So if we were to apply the narrative of the 1960s, the long 60s, we see drag emerging from a moment where there is this proliferation of queer social movements, for women, civil rights movements, Black Power, things like that. And then if you were to look at more of a modern perspective, if you were to use the term modern to think about drag in the past 10 years, it would be very easy to kind of dislocate it from its political history. So this is coming from a foundation of Michel Foucault's work on power and knowledge. So this idea that discourse, which is again more than just what we say, but the kind of meaning that oscillates around those words or those ideas, we need to be thinking about when we are looking at geographies of sexuality or looking at drag, what sources are we using? What available research is there? And as many of you probably know from doing research in other classes or in your creative project, you may go out looking for a particular topic, thinking about, I want to know more about drag kings in the UK. And then when you're unable to find, based on the search engine or the source, when you're unable to find those things, you can start to see patterns of holes in particular forms of research. So if we were to call something drag studies, we will obviously see a lot of holes in terms of research on drag kings, as we found from our class where we looked at drag king history and research and the kind of lack of historical documentation we have around drag kings. And after sources, we can think about who is telling the story. So one of the groups earlier on in our discussion on Stonewall read a piece that was written as a firsthand account of the Stonewall riots, of the nights of the Stonewall riots in June 1969. And it goes between different voices. And it's not so much trying to create a snapshot of what actually happened, but the ways that people who were there experienced that moment, and also experience the kind of like cultural memory of Stonewall, and questions of if we're doing oral history, we're interviewing people to ask them about their life, for them to tell us if they're talking about an event that happened 2 years ago or 20 years ago, it could be a very different story. And that's not necessarily saying that memory isn't a valid source of knowing, but it's more interesting to think about the way our memories change as time goes on. finally, this idea of spatial history, of course, makes us consider things like maps and mapping. And this is very useful for looking at LGBTQ histories of the past and thinking about um, trying to document queer spaces, say they bars or clubs or even parks that people would frequent, and juxtaposing that with what we see now. So, what spaces are still there? Um, we will talk about this on Friday. I will show you several maps of some of the older gay bars in Vancouver that are no longer around, including the oldest drag bar in Vancouver.